Okay, so chapter 9 is interesting because it talks about speeding home in reverse, the controlling metaphor. And what Coet is giving a lot of examples here of this idea of extended metaphors with many of the poems that he includes in this section. Um, the whole poem becomes a metaphor. The way that he talks about the fable or parable, something is functioning metaphorically. The story is expressing a greater truth about our lives or the world around us. So these different examples that you're going to see in this chapter are very interesting because from the sentence that normally we begin with the first line, but here in a lot of these examples, the titles either lead into the actual bodies of the poems or the titles lead us into the same sort of piece of exploring something beyond what is physically kind of in front of us here. So I think that's really very particularly interesting to look at, especially with imagery. And for example, okay, we can go through this one here. Untitled. She was the perfect woman until he had discovered she had a mania for flesh. He'd come in late at night. She'd be gnawing away at it under the covers. Okay, from right off the bat, you can see here this is sort of a overarching kind of piece where she kept jars of it in the medicine cabinet, and when she kept telling him she had a headache, he would lay there looking at the ceiling, knowing what she was really doing. So this whole poem kind of going through very much as a metaphor that extends beyond what is just on the page. Here, the farewell, as he says, goes far more beyond what is on the page, and sort of illuminating us about kind of what we can see here. The idea that, you can start off right from the beginnings with these titles and deliver through the entire piece of your poems. The examples that he gives here, when you read through them, are all about different types of fantasies. But some of them can be very much straightforward metaphors too. Um, Here you have to a daughter leaving home. When I taught you at 8 to ride a bicycle, looping around beside you as you wobbled away on 2 round wheels, my own mouth rounding in surprise when you pulled ahead down the curved path of the park. I kept waiting for the thud of your crash as I sprinted to catch up, while you grew smaller, more breakable with distance, pumping for your life, screaming with laughter, the hair flapping behind you like a handkerchief waving goodbye. So, this idea of looking at sort of that evolution, the extended, the daughter growing from smaller to bigger, growing up in time, and how thus the poet feels sort of about that. You're gonna have a lot of these in this section, and so it's really looking at the extension of really looking at the extension of what's beyond the page, and that's kind of what I want you to, some of them can be a little bit difficult to think about at first, but others than that, I think you'll really, really kind of enjoy. It could be an autobiographical metaphor, a dream metaphor, because of course dreams often function as complex metaphors. Using a vivid dream of your own as the basis for a poem that could be kind of fun to sort of look at. And that really leads into kind of like chapter 10 here. And we're going to go into a lot of these as well, where he talks about myth, legend, and pop icon. So, kind of going through a lot of these pieces, how do you sort of distinguish and go through, a good sense of these poems here? How do you use what we already have? How do you use mythology, fables, structures? How do you put that into your pieces? How do you transform what's already there? Like these fairy tales, these familiar tales. So this is one of my favorites. Gretel said she didn't know anything about ovens, so the witch crawled in to show her, and bam, went the big door. Then she strolled out to the shed where her brother was fattening, knocked down a wall, and lifted him high in the air. Not long after the adventure in the forest, Gretel married so she could live happily. Her husband was as soft as Hansel. Her husband liked to eat. He liked to see her in the oven with the pies and cakes. Ever after was the size of a kitchen. Gretel remembered when times were better. She laughed out loud when the witch popped like a weenie. Gretel, stop fooling around and fix my dinner. There's something wrong with this oven, she says, her eyes bright as treasure. Can you come here a minute? So, okay, this is obviously a much different re-envisioned piece of Gretel, but the humor, in this piece is really funny. But as Coet says here, you can still really see how well the story, the narrative in this poem is constructed, and how good, you evoke sort of your senses and your visions and your very much language in this piece too. So another great one by Billy Collins uses a quote-unquote mythological figure, flames. Smokey the Bear heads into the autumn woods with a red can of gasoline and a box of matches. His hat is cocked at a disturbing angle. The moonlight catches the teeth of his smile. His paws, the size of catcher's mitts, crackle into the distance. He is sick of dispensing warnings to the careless, the half-wit camper, the dumbbell hiker. He is going to show them how a professional does it. No one runs after him with the famous lecture. So of course you have that iconic image of Smokey the Bear telling everyone not to smoke and not to prevent, not to bring danger and have forest fires. And of course here you have this really, sort of disturbing and very sort of turned around picture of Smokey the Bear, when really it's meant to be a very satirical kind of activist piece. So there's a couple others like that where Coet uses examples of how we use very much fables, mythology, allusions to mythology, other poets, comic books, any type of other sort of bigger than known character in our pieces. And it's really kind of fun to do certain plays and retellings because we're living in such different contemporary times. So we're totally going to do some of these exercises because I think you're really, really going to like them. And I think especially using the idea of some sort of, if you want to call them famous figures or however, pop culture icons, however you kind of want to put that. But as you're reading through this section, definitely kind of take note of that because I think it's really important. And to skim the last section, he titles Family Secrets, which is the poem as a photograph. And there should be no surprise to you when you look at these here that photographs are really great ways of telling stories. And, whether a simplistic or more detailed photograph, a story always comes out of a picture. And so one thing you kind of want to look at here is talking about imagery, especially when you have poems about photographs. What do they kind of reveal about the stories behind them? Who's telling us the stories? So, for example, here, I'll actually look at My Wicked Ways. My wicked, wicked ways. This is my father. See, he is young. He looks like Errol Flynn. He is wearing a hat that tips over one eye, a suit that fits him good, and baggy pants. He is also wearing those awful shoes, the two-toned ones my mother hates. Here is my mother. She is not crying. She cannot look into the lens because the sun is bright. The woman, the one my father knows, is not here. She does not come till later. My mother will get very mad. Her face will turn red, and she will throw one shoe. My father will say nothing. After a while, everyone will forget it. Years and years will pass. My mother will stop mentioning it. This is me she is carrying. I am a baby. She does not know I will turn out bad. So here by Sandra Cisneros, you might have read before, House on Mango Street. The poet goes outside the photograph and is telling a story, but she's also referring to the photograph throughout the different lines, and thus that's how the poem becomes a photograph. So you'll have some of these examples, some more forthright, some a little bit more mysterious to kind of go through. And we'll be doing some exercises and pieces around this, which can be very, very, very interesting to kind of tell a poem in this sort of way. I like it. It keeps you detailed, but also sort of in a great deal of suspense. Of course, as it says here, not all photographs these days are still photographs. Some can be based on film footage, an imaginary photo, however you might kind of see those in here. So it could be based on a TV scene, whatever that type of image is that you're looking at. So we're going to definitely go through these a little bit more. I think you'll have fun looking at snapshots. I really like writing off photos, but they don't only have to be photos As one of your exercises say, you can do a news photo. You can have a lot of sort of experimentation that sort of goes with that too. So I think that's a really fun piece to kind of sort of collect upon. I know there's a lot of different types and categories you've been looking at thus far. We won't get to everything, but it's good and nice exposure to have a good sense of a lot of these really variant types of poetry and different ways of approaching reading poetry. Again, this is our intro to writing poetry class, so hopefully in the future one day you might want to take a more advanced class where you can focus on maybe some of these different types more intensely. But here we're just skimming the surface a little bit more and giving ourselves a wide range to figure out which ones you end up liking the most. And maybe you really love writing haikus, or maybe you really like writing these longer sort of poems that come out of images that you know and that you see. Whatever you find, maybe you really like reading and writing poetry referencing pop culture. That's very cool as well. So I'm just happy to expose you to all these different types. These are just a brief outline, as I said. Please read a little bit more intensely into these chapters, and they'll be parts of our discussion this week.